Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, wherever you are. I like to imagine we have audience all over the world because I'm allowed to imagine, as I don't know, indeed. So I sort of exploit the uncertainty of speaking in front of the screen, imagining, like those rocks are, thank you very much for being here tonight, something like that. So I'm just talking a bit while participants join the webinar, and but welcome, and thank you for joining this fourth episode of the Summer of Love. Time flies. This may be the fourth episode, but it is the first that I conceived when organizing the series. In fact, the whole idea, I think that Sam Chan, welcome, was probably the one to blame because of, one to blame for the organization of this series of dialogues on digital romance. Because I was just browsing on Twitter, and amongst some fake news about COVID and something terrible about Boris Johnson, I stumbled into Sam's new book, The Politics of Dating Apps, published by the MIT Press, and I was like, great, I want to invite this person. This book looks amazing. And I said, perhaps I can arrange an event. And here we are today. And then I was like, okay, who do I invite to team up with Sam? And Jamie was the first person that came to mind. So thank you, Jamie Hakim, for being here today. When I was at King's, I was a teaching fellow at King's some 5 years ago. And I think you were also there, right? Yes,
I
you
was,
just
yeah.
left. I think I actually replaced you as a teaching fellow there.
Oh, small world.
And I read your article. I think it was published not long before, Fit is the New Rich, which I found one of the most interesting accounts of the construction of masculinity and the relationship between body and class and work. And so since then, I've been following Jamie's work, which I believe is one of the most interesting voices on masculinity and sexuality and the entanglement with social, economic, and cultural context and factors. So this is why Jamie and Sam are here today. But let's know something more about them in a more professional way. So Sam Chan is assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communication at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And his research addresses the intersection between gender, media technology, and culture. So you see why actually Sam is here today, and I'm so pleased that he's here. He's author of The Politics of Dating Apps, Gender, Sexuality, and Emergent Publics in Urban China, published by the MIT Press this year. And we'll hear something more about it in a few minutes. He's also running a research network called Digital Experiences and Relationship in his institute. And when it comes to Jamie Hakim, he's a lecturer in culture, media, and creative industries at King's College in London. And his research interests lie at the intersection of digital cultures, intimacy, embodiment, and care. His book, Work That Body, Male Bodies in Digital Cultures, was published by Roman and Littlefield in 2019. And he's also the principal investigator of the ESRC-funded Digital Intimacy. And I want to know more about how you got this money to do this project. I want to copy the template. This is for our virtual drink post-talk. And this project investigates how gay and bisexual men use the smartphone to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. So I think we'll hear more about this in your talk. As part of the CARE Collective, which is a very interesting initiative, I participated to a couple of your seminars, and I suggest everybody to have a look if you haven't already. So as part of the CARE Collective, he has also co-authored the CARE Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence. And let's hope that the CARE Manifesto somehow managed to get, at least in part, actualized. He will be so good. And when it comes to me, perhaps you know me already because you have been here before, but if not, and in any case, I am Carolina Bandinelli. I am a lecturer, assistant professor in media and creative industries at Warwick, and I have decided to organize and curate this Summer of Love because I've always wondered what is love. And after I finished my PhD and submitted my monograph and got my first permanent job a few years ago, I was like, okay, enough with the creative industries, enough with social entrepreneurs, who are the topic of my monograph and other publication. Now, let's talk about love. So let's talk about love with Sam, and then we'll have Jamie, and then at some point we will gather everybody here as panelists, which means that we'll be all part of the meeting in the same kind of respect. So the affordance will change for us to have a final debate. So I must say that the final debates are usually the most interesting part. So I tell the presenters, and first of all myself, to keep it relatively brief and be faithful in the opportunity to expand during the final debate. Hence, without further ado, Sam, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Carolina, for the invitation. Really happy to be here today. In fact, when I was researching my book, I read Jamie's article. So I think I was so happy when you suggest Jamie to be in this conversation. And Jamie, I'm looking forward to have the conversation with you afterwards. So Carolina told me that I have 20 minutes. So I will talk about a little bit about my book. Like Carolina just tells all of you, in March, I published my first book, The Politics of Dating Apps. Here in the chat box, I give you the full title so that you can Google. It's free of charge, actually, in MIT Press. So if you have time, go to the press and then you can download the book for free. So in this 20 minutes, I will first spend 5 minutes-ish to talk about the general theme of this book. This is very quick and dirty summary. But expect to read more, to learn more when you read the book. And then I will spend more of the time to talk about one specific chapter, which is gay men's use of dating apps in China. All right. So the general theme of the book, actually, you can look from the title. So when the editor and I was brainstorming the book title, the team suggested me to put something catchy at the very beginning. That's why the politics of dating apps. But then try to be explicit as possible in the afterwards: gender, sexuality, emerging publics. So basically my books talk about these 3 aspects: gender, sexuality, and something I will show you that I call network sexual publics. So for the gender parts, I have 2 chapters that look into whether dating apps can be a feminist tool. Bumble, was designed so that women had to initiate. Bumble is not available in China. So what about apps in China? Can they be regarded as a feminist tool? Then I have a paired chapter to talk about what kinds of masculinities are performed by Chinese straight men. So I do recommend you to read these 2 chapters together because when I wrote it, I actually wrote them back and forth. So they can be a dialogue in themselves. Then I moved to sexuality because I'm also concerned about not just straight men and women. Oh, by the way, apologize for making binary conceptualization, but I have a reason for that. I will show you later. And then apart from straight men and women, I also look into queer men and women and their experience of using dating apps. So I spent 2 chapters to look at their experience. For the men part, which I will give you a details presentation later on, is about why gay men always delete and install and delete the same app again and again and again. This is something that I found very interesting among my informants in Guangzhou, a city in southern China. For the lesbian women part, I talk about whether lesbian dating apps in China can help build their queer community. So this is gender, sexuality, right? The third part of the book, I talk about the network sexual publics. for your easy understanding, let me just copy and paste the text for you here. Yeah, network sexual publics. I create this term deliberately for a reason. You know, when the dating app study started in 2010, it first was mainly all about HIV, gay men, HIV prevention transmission among gay men. The reason is 2009 we have Grindr, and we have to wait for until 2012 we have Tinder. So between 2009 and 2012, in this entire universe, there's only Grindr. So that's why I'm not surprised that scholars, when they look at dating apps, they focus so much on HIV transmission and prevention. Then later on, we see more study looking at hookups and associated risks, such as privacy or personal safety. Then I would say in the mid 2012 onward, I started to realize, or I started to notice there are scholars looking, psychologists as well as interpersonal communication scholars. They look at dating apps as a way to compare online and offline. They want to see whether a relationship initiated online is the same as those offline. So good. I think these are all important discussions that we have to look into. However, I found something missing. So it took me some time to actually articulate what is missing. The missing part is about power. The power relation in the use of dating apps. And of course, when I talk about powers, I'm not talking about the election or Trump or Brexit, etc. But it's about how different groups of people on dating apps, they actually negotiate or compete with their chance of living a life. For example, queer women and queer men in China, or straight women. How can they fight against patriarchy in Chinese society? So dating apps actually become a site for such power, resistance, and dynamics and dominance. The reason why I have to coin the term network sexual publics, no one like new terms. But I think if without these terms, people would just think, oh, this book must be about hookups, must be about relationships. I want to make sure my readers know that this is beyond just hooking up. There's actually a political dimension to this dating app culture. So this is the general theme about my book. And I want to go into one specific chapter, which is chapter 4. I call it Cycles of Uninstalling and Reinstalling. Gay men use dating apps for lots of reasons, like hookup, friends, chit chat. They want to look for community. They want to kill time because they're waiting for the Starbucks, right? So they open the app. So if it's so useful, why do they keep deleting or reinstalling the same app again and again? And this is really, really common among all my informants. They have done the same thing. They delete it and then restore it the next day, and then delete again. So other scholars who have been looking at this kinds of use and non-use of communication technology, they usually take a qualitative approach. The famous model is called the Technology Acceptance Model, TAM. This model argues that whether you use the technology depends on, number one, whether you think it's useful or not. Number two, whether you think you can use it. Is it too difficult? So if this new laptop, you found this laptop is useful and you think you know how to use it, then you tend to use it. The model is very simple. And it's very overly simple, I would say. And then once you start using it, you realize, well, actually, it's not that useful. It doesn't connect. I'm just making things up. I'm just making things up. It doesn't connect to the internet. It's not useful. Or it's actually so complicated. You have very different set of shortcuts, shortkeys. So you do not know how to use it. So you stop using it. Basically, the technology acceptance model look at use and non-use from this rational decision. And in fact, there's one study conducted by Brooker about quitting Grindr. You can just Google that title, leaving Grindr. And the reason they identify include users found app is time wasting, or they found that using the app cannot help them to look for the relationship they want. Actually, this is implicitly a cognitive approach, looking at whether something is useful or not. However, such a purely cognitive approach cannot explain why these people, my informants, keep deleting, installing, deleting, installing. I can keep going on and on. again, because our evaluation, our cognitive evaluation of something do not change that quickly. Your evaluation will change, but that probably takes you maybe a week, 3 months, etc. It doesn't, your cognitive evaluation of technology do not change overnight. So what's happening? And I turn to affect and emotion. In fact, this is something that I hear from my interview when I talk to my gay male informants. They start to articulate emotions. They start to talk about things that they feel. And here, let me share a quote with you. I will put it in the chat box, but of course, I will also read it, explain to you a little bit. So here's the quote in the chat box. So I copy and paste twice. I apologize for that. So this is from River, a young gay man. I have uninstalled the app multiple times. It is a cycle. I believe many Blue is the most dominant gay app in China. So it can be the US Grindr, equivalent to US Grindr. So many Blue app users have a similar experience to mine. And for this app, after you uninstall it, you install it again. Then you feel it's meaningless feeling here. You uninstall it again for different reasons or feeling upset. You feel something. You just do not want to log onto the app again. Then you reinstall it the next day. So it's very apparent from this quotation, and actually from a lots of interview, that there's an emotion, there's a feeling aspect to the relationship with the apps. So I start look at these kinds of affective articulation. And what's interesting, emotion change quickly. Our emotion to something, to an object, change much quickly than our cognitive evaluation. And maybe at that time I was thinking, maybe this is the key why people just keep installing and uninstalling like just overnight. So I start to identify different types of emotion in relation to app use, and eventually I identified two sets of emotion. So in my book, I call it in-app emotion and out-of-app emotion. It's very straightforward. In-app emotions are emotions induced at the use of the app. I will give you more example later on. Out-of-app emotion is not directly about the app, but about gay men living in China, their experience in everyday life, but how they bring their experience in everyday life into this app context. So in-app and out of the app. And apart from differentiating in-app and out of app, I also look at positive and negative. Of course, human emotions are way complicated than that. I'm simplifying stuff for the sake of analysis. We often experience both positive, negative, heavy, light emotion at the same time. It's not easy to tease them apart, but analytically, we can look at what is positive, what is negative. So when I look at in-app positive emotion, the first thing that comes into my analysis is actually joy, which I do not need to repeat a lot, because lots of study looking at Grindr or Jack, other apps, argue that because of GPS, gay men no longer need to go to gay bars or bathroom, or no longer need to go walk on the street to look for others. They actually, using GPS, they can find gay men easily nearby, especially in the context in Guangzhou, the city where I conduct my research. But gay bars are very far away from city center, and sometimes they're hidden. And in fact, half of my younger informants, they did not know the city of gay bars. So they actually, when Blue appeared, the app in China, they Blue appear, they feel like, oh, this is how the only way that they can look for their peers. So this is the in-app emotion, joy. But there's also negative aspect of that. The dominant negative in-app emotion is disgust. That mainly came from harassment. So my informants told me that older app users always send them like messages or even images every day, even though they explicitly reject those invitations. And these harassing messages can be very direct and vulgar, which I do not have to repeat here. And my informants often consider these behaviors as without 素质. So 素质 is Chinese term. It refers to quality. And in the past, gay men usually use 素质 to refers to the so-called money boy from the rural area, because money boy, they may be gay for money, but these people are actually from the rural area and they come to the urban to try to make money out from us. That's why they would call those rural money boy low or lacking in 素质. And my informants are using this phrase, lacking in 素质, to refers to this older gay men who do not know how to respect others on apps, keep sending harassing messages. So this in-app emotion, we have the joy and disgust. Of course, like I said, there's more than just the app. There's out-of-app emotion. The most dominant out-of-app emotion on the positive aspect is hope. Hope of what? Hope of gaining social acceptance one day. The dominant rhetoric in Western LGBTQ activism is actually pride, right? As in the gay pride events happening from the 70s in US. Pride is an emotion that you have when you feel happy or when you feel like you accomplished because of your own action in the past. But unfortunately, in the context of China, the local Chinese queer community has very little to feel proud of. Due to the limited freedom of speech and assembly, there's actually no large-scale LGBTQ events in China. For example, the Beijing Queer Film Festival, which used to be fantastic, started in 2001, it stopped permanently in 2014. Another example, the award-winning gay movie, Call Me By Your Name, was actually originally included in the Beijing International Film Festival in 2018, but it was pulled out from the screening before it was launched. And when I was in Guangzhou, actually, it happened to be the Guangzhou Gay Pride event. All events were canceled just before it started because of the sensitivity as recognized by the government in Guangzhou. So there's nothing much that my gay informants can feel proud of. But hope works on a very different logic. Hope look at the future. Pride look at the back. Hope look at the future. So hope is to expect something good may happen. And because those things has never happened yet, it's actually very hard to discount because they can always have hope. Whenever something very tiny happened in the past, they can say that, they can argue that, hey, this is the seed. Maybe this small tiny things in the future, it can become big. One thing that my informants keep telling me is, again, in 2018, it was happened in Weibo, the Chinese Twitter. So in 2018 April, Weibo banned all gay content. But after 4 days, because of a series of online protests, Weibo reversed that ban. And in fact, People's Daily, the mouthpiece of the Chinese government, also wrote an editorial piece saying that the society should be tolerant to sexual minority. So my informants always quote this example, and then they told me that, hey, look at this. So although we do not have Pride event in China, we have that the queer film festival canceled. But look at this tiny thing. This may imply that in the future that we as a community, we can be socially accepted. And the gay dating apps, Blue, also serve as an indicator. They feel like because today we can have the app, in the future we can actually may have a visible physical community. And here I want to show you my last quote of today. It's from Jerry. So he say that although these apps, Blue, etc., other gay apps in China are not a mainstream thing, their existence and the online interactions they support allow Guangzhou, the city that I did my research, 同志 means sexual minorities. So allow these Guangzhou sexual minorities to survive. Dating apps represent our existence. Apps give me hope. It's a very powerful, actually, it's a very powerful emotion articulation. So this is the positive out of app emotion. And let me go to the last one, which is the negative out of app emotion, and that is fear. Fear is actually rooted in the social stigma of male homosexuality in China. The process of it's very hard to pronounce this word, depathological I cannot pronounce that, demedicalization of male homosexuality. It come very late. It came in 2001 when the Chinese classification of mental disorders removed homosexuality as an illness. But social stigma remains, and most of my informants in the 20s and 30s, none of them have come up to their family members, and they did not plan to do so. They also will not come out to their colleagues, especially those who work in traditional masculine career like software engineering or personal trainings. So they know that, or they feel that, or they're afraid that once they come out, they will not be promoted. So fears come from, like hope, fears is about in the future. So it comes from expecting something bad in the future. It doesn't mean that you have already experienced that. But as long as you feel like there's a chance, you will be afraid of something. And there's lots of online story that circulate among my gay male informants groups. Like someone actually was found gay because they're using Blue or other gay apps, and then their supervisor fired him. So lots of stories, lots of we can never verify whether those stories are true or not. But this myth or legends actually make my informants feel like, oh, they may be found out. So we have a bunch of mixed emotions with in-app, out-of-app, positive and negative. And then all these things mixed together with become a contradictory set of affect in relation to dating app use. I know I'm running out of time, so I want to wrap up quickly with the work from sociologist Eddie Kuzman. So Kuzman argued that, or urged us to pay attention to how affect and emotions take through movement between contexts. Although I'm just looking at dating apps, but I've shown you, actually, I'm also talking about the macro social context, how to interact with the micro in-app context. So emotions form this affective structure that both sometimes push my informants to the app, but sometimes pull them out. And I want to stop here. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the conversation later on. And I would look at the questions as well.
Thank you. And already your presentation has generated some debate in the chat, so we can already feel the participation from our audience and friends. I think it's very interesting, and we exchanged a few emails before in preparation, in a sense, for this talk, that you looked at this affective economy that participants and users have with the app itself, so that the app is conceptualized and thought not only as a mediator between, as something that mediates relationship between other humans, but it becomes an affective, a libidinal object in itself, which is also what Arturo Bandinelli and Arturo is here, so ciao Arturo. We argue in our article, and now I'm keeping on doing research and interviewing participants, and this on and off relationship with the app, this deleting and reinstalling, and this cycle that you were pointing at is very much there. So I think it is something that does not only concern Chinese gay men, but it is something that perhaps we can generalize. Of course, it's not always the case, but there is a sense in which it is it's inherent to this contradictory and ambiguous libidinal economy to be pushed out and attracted back, which is something specific, I believe, of an erotic, of a romantic relationship, attraction and disgust somehow. So we'll carry on talking about it, but I think that you captured something quite important. And the other aspect is how we need to understand dating apps and apps in general, by the way, in relation to the social, cultural, economic context. And it's quite, I think it's quite revealing, because sometimes you hear some Western scholars or voices longing for the good old times before the app, the dating apocalypse the app as the ultimate cooptation, but we can see how for other communities in other contexts, but also in fact in the West, for certain people in certain situations, the app can also be a political tool for struggle or empowerment, or like for creating a collective identity. So I think that you really kind of brought to the fore two quite important aspects, and I'm sure that Jamie will carry this forward. So Jamie,
Thank you, Carolina, and
tell
thank
us
you.
Everything.
I'm not on mute. Okay. Thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Sam. I mean, that was beautiful, actually. And I think what was very interesting about that talk is you gave some of the backstage to the book that I read and provided kind of further context to how you arrived at the approach that you did. And so that was very illuminating for me. And Carolina, thank you for the invitation to engage with Sam's book. This invitation has provided me with a very exciting opportunity to seriously engage with Sam's book, The Politics of Dating Apps. It's a groundbreaking piece of scholarship. It's beautifully written, it's cogently argued, and it incorporates sometimes moving ethnographic detail and sheds new light, at least to Anglophone audiences, on hookup app use amongst different social groups in China. So Carolina has asked me to respond to Sam's book with my own work in mind. And indeed, there are many overlaps. So what I'm going to do in this talk is focus on three particular points of overlap, including the productive differences, and explain what insights they generated for me. So these points of overlap are, firstly, that the book's major claim that hookup apps, dating apps, have a politics. Secondly, how masculinity is represented on these apps. And finally, the effective contradictions for queer Chinese men, as Sam has so beautifully outlined, not only when they log on to the apps, but also in inhabiting China's shifting sexual, social, and political terrains. Okay, so the first part of the talk. As I've just said, Sam's major argument is that hookup apps have a politics. In the opening chapter, he writes, "In this book, I argue that these apps are not merely software running on mobile phones. They are portals that transport people from their mundane physical environment to an exciting virtual world full of relational possibilities." You see what I mean by beautifully written. At the same time, dating apps are sites of power dynamics impacted by the heteronormativity and patriarchy infused throughout Chinese society. So first off, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And there are different ways into researching hookup apps, and Sam talked about those. But like Sam, I'm also interested in their politics and the politics of digital cultures more generally. So I take a different approach to Sam. I'm especially attached to a particular approach pioneered by Stuart Hall and his colleagues at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the 1970s. Called Conjunctural Analysis, this methodology of sorts attempts to uncover the politics of popular culture and everyday life. The term conjuncture is Marxist and refers to an historical period, specifically the arrangement of social relations within an historical period: social, cultural, economic, political, technological, and so on. There are different ways of carrying out conjunctural analysis. The way that I use it follows on from the CCCS classic Policing the Crisis, whereby you take a cultural object or cultural formation and make sense of it within all its conjunctural relations, in order to firstly understand why that cultural formation has emerged in the way that it has, and secondly, have a clearer sense of the direction that conjuncture is moving in. So I've already used this approach in one project, my book, Work That Body, whereby I look at the increase in different sorts of men, at least in the Anglo-American context, using digital media to sexualize their bodies over the past decades. I argue they do this as a way of negotiating, living through the difficulties of post-2010 neoliberal austerity. either to create value when value creation has become more difficult for everyone, or as a way to create intensely felt, those short-lived moments of collectivity in a time when competitive individualism was being re-insisted on. I'm also using conjunctural analysis in a project that I'm currently working on, the ESRC-funded Digital Intimacies, how gay and bisexual men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. We're halfway through this project, so as yet there are no final conclusions. However, like Sam, in this project, we're interested in the politics of how gay men engage in smartphone-mediated intimacies and are similarly attentive to the broader contexts in which they do this. So Sam doesn't use conjunctural analysis in his work, yet the book is full of rich contextual detail that is absolutely vital to his analysis of how his participants are using hookup apps and the politics thereof. Adapting Giddens to the Chinese context, he provides useful outlines of the transformations of intimacy that have happened there, from the collectivizing imperatives of revolutionary China to the decollectivization or neoliberalization that happened after 1979, and the attendant detraditionalization of intimacy that happened as a result. This detraditionalization facilitated the increase of premarital heterosexual dating, and a little later, the cultural changes around the limited acceptance of LGBTQ life that continues today. So these are the broad conjunctural conditions that the dating app cultures that Sam analyzes have emerged in. And in outlining them, he not only helps an Anglophone audience less familiar with the Chinese context, myself included, understand hookup up use there, but also, I would wager, sharpens and enriches the understanding of scholars of Chinese cultures of intimacy, digital or otherwise. A second point of overlap between mine and Sam's work is our concern with how masculinity is represented in digital spaces, specifically the relationship between masculinity and femininity in these representations. So in chapter 3 of Sam's book, Cute is the New Manly, he uses a debate around hegemonic masculinity to frame his analysis of how cisgender heterosexual men from Guangzhou represents themselves on dating apps. He shows how hegemonic masculinity in this context is structured by the Wen-Wu dyad. Wen refers to a form of masculinity based on scholarly and cultural refinement, whereas Wu refers to physical prowess. This dyad has a long history in Chinese culture. However, Sam notes how the Wen part changes after Chinese economic liberalization in the 1980s, when it begins to incorporate financial and economic success too. One of the findings I found most fascinating from the book is that when Sam's participants construct their dating app profiles, they rely exclusively on Wen forms of masculinity, foregoing representations of physical prowess, Wu, entirely. For instance, they engaged in extensive image labor to create profile pictures that were either photos of cute animals, cute photos of themselves, influenced by images from Korean popular culture, or photos that flaunted their financial success. That cuteness, a visual style only associated with femininity or childishness in the context I research, is a form of hegemonic masculinity is quite remarkable. And entirely in keeping with the debate on hegemonic masculinity, Sam finds that these men, whilst deploying different forms of wenness, also spoke and acted in sexist ways towards the women on these dating apps. So they talked disdainfully about women who flaunted their financial success in ways that are acceptable for men. They ranked women based on their perceived attractiveness. And they talked about women who they hooked up with as if they were concubines, and I think that's the word that they use. I too am interested in the image labor that men engage in to represent themselves on their social media profiles. I don't use hegemonic masculinity theory to make sense of this, instead using various literatures on gendered embodiment that, like Sam, is attentive to the specificities of the cultural context in which they emerge. In work I did around 2015 on spawner sexuality, and that word's a portmanteau term that combines sports star, porn star, and metrosexual, I noted an increase in young British men going to the gym and sharing sexualized images of their muscular bodies, not only on dating apps, but on more mainstream social media platforms too. Like Sam, economic liberalization, more specifically neoliberalization, in the form of the austerity measures brought in by the UK coalition government in 2010, provides the context that produces this sort of mediated masculinity. I argue that it's precisely because the austerity context has diminished the opportunities for value creation for this generation of young men that they have to turn to their bodies to feel valuable by sharing images of them for likes, comments, retweets, etc. on social media. Obviously, the visuals are very different here to the cute pics of when masculinity that Sam discusses. However, the relationship to gender is, at least to me, similarly unexpected. In the Western context, sexualizing your body in visual culture to create value is a representational tactic long associated with femininity. And the fact that young men are doing it in such numbers, I argue, shows their weakening of power under neoliberalism, demonstrating that neoliberalism in 2015 was no longer serving even social groups that older forms of capitalism had bequeathed relative privilege. So this analysis is not appropriate to Guangzhou, but the articulation between unpredictable gender associations and economic liberalism or neoliberalism represented in digital mediations of masculinity in both contexts was striking to me. The final point I want to discuss relates to chapter 4, cycles of uninstalling and reinstalling. So the chapter that Sam has just talked about, and so there's going to be a bit of repetition here. In this chapter, Sam wants to understand why the queer men he interviewed went through continuous cycles of installing, uninstalling, and then reinstalling the hookup apps that they used. He argues that, and this is a quote, "This phenomenon is a manifestation of the ambivalence toward gay dating apps felt by my queer male informants. I also suggest that these contradictory emotions emerged from both using these apps and living as gay men in China." And as you've seen, he arrives at this conclusion by undertaking what we might call an affective analysis of his participants' hookup app use, asking them what affects their use of these apps mobilize. The picture they paint is highly ambivalent and involves what Sam calls both in-app and out-of-app emotions. Before he explains what these affective contradictions are, he provides some important, we might say, conjunctural context that is vital to the understanding of their emergence. And he does this by charting the path of homosexuality through China's legal and medical systems, as well as social attitudes from the pre-revolutionary 20th century to now. He explains that the combination of economic liberalization, the rise of the internet, and certain forms of media representation have produced openings in Chinese culture and society for the growth of some form of Chinese queer life. He also explains that despite these openings, homosexuality is still not really accepted by the wider Chinese public. It is in this contradiction that the ambivalence the queer men he spoke to feels can be located. In terms of being on the apps, again, as you heard, they talked about the joy of being able to safely express and act on their sexual desires, but anger and disgust at catfishing, harassment, and receiving unsolicited dick pics. Remarkably, again for me, not nearly as acceptable on Chinese gay dating apps as they are on their counterparts in the global north. In terms of out-of-app emotions, these participants were fearful of being outed, especially to their parents, but also hopeful because the hookup app suggested there might be greater freedoms for gay men in Chinese society in the future. And he has some lovely data to support this. So for instance, he writes, and again, this is a quote, River, one of his informants, even compared gay dating apps to the Christian gospel. In the gospel, faith in Jesus would bring believers eternal life in the future. To River, gay dating apps would bring him a gay community in the future. And that's very powerful. It was these contradictions that explained the magnetic push and pull of hookup apps for Chinese gay men and the uninstalling, reinstalling cycle they got caught up in. So the question of uninstalling, reinstalling is coming up in the digital intimacies project I'm involved in. And like Sam, we're also trying to place acts such as this within their wider historical context. In this project, we're looking at gay male smartphone use, which includes dating app use, but also looks at other social media platforms, video conferencing platforms, the camera and the phone. We finished the interviews and have only just begun the serious analysis, but nevertheless, some major themes are beginning to take shape. One of these themes relating to smartphone use relates to smartphone use more broadly, but also includes acts like uninstalling and reinstalling dating apps. We've also found that their smartphone use is an effectively contradictory experience for our interviewees. However, the major contradiction for us is between vulnerability and control. When we asked our interviewees what intimacy meant to them, a surprising number defined it in terms of being vulnerable in front of another person or other people. For some, it meant the vulnerability of being physically naked in a sexual encounter. For others, it meant showing another person the most vulnerable parts of your psyche. What the different functions of the smartphone appear to do in this context was give our interviewees a sense of control over these feelings of vulnerability in their intimate lives. And I'll put this quote that I'm about to say into the chat, like Sam, that's a really good idea. Yeah, okay. So one of our interviewees said this: I see this with my boyfriends, you know, where the topic is literally like maybe important, but represents something for someone that is vulnerable. They would prefer to reach me on WhatsApp because they're more in control on when to stop and when to post, what they have more time to think about their words. So the idea that you use your smartphone to gain a sense of control over these moments when your vulnerability might overwhelm you is a common refrain within our data and is spoken about in relation to the smartphone's various affordances. The question for us is why? There are different ways of accounting for this. In the psychoanalytically inflected queer theory literature, which I'm sure Carolina perhaps knows more than I do, that's often used to make sense, the psychoanalytically inflected queer theory literature is often used to make sense of queer intimacies. The subject's vulnerability is ontological. Lee Edelman and Lauren Balan have published a discussion about what they call the non-sovereignty of the subject and how this non-sovereignty is intensified or at least takes on specific forms in the realm of intimacy. Could our smart devices be a way of attempting to gain mastery over the non-sovereignty of intimacy? Possibly, but like Sam, we're minded to understand these dynamics in a more historical, for us, conjunctural way. There are different ways to define intimacy. So what conjunctural reasons might there be for our participants to define intimacy in terms of vulnerability and smartphone use in terms of control? We started looking at different literatures to explain this. For instance, the literature on precarity argues that under neoliberalism, all our lives have become more precarious as the state withdraws from public life, leaving us more vulnerable when we fend for ourselves. Others have argued that it's precisely this sense of precarity that has provided the breeding ground for the hollow certainties of right-wing populism. And in the UK context, the desire to take back control through Brexit. Could our participants talk of vulnerability and control be an expression of these conjunctural dynamics in their intimate lives? Or perhaps it makes more sense to situate their statements within what we might call the coronavirus conjuncture. I mean, indeed, that's when we're interviewing them, in which intimate contact with another person makes us all vulnerable to infection, more so if you belong to a so-called vulnerable group, and when attempts to control the virus, in the words of a 2020 government slogan, have been fitful at best. We'll see, but like Sam, we too want to understand the affects generated by digital media use within their wider out-of-app historical context. I'm pretty sure we're running out of time, so by way of conclusion, I'll say this. I was very grateful for Carolina's invitation to respond to Sam's book. It had been on my reading list for a while, and this was an opportunity for an in-depth engagement. And engaging with it and all the similarities and differences it has with my own work could not have come at a better time. As we begin the serious work of data analysis on the Digital Intimacies Project, Sam's book has given me and my team much food for thought. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite you to all over again, because you have been so perfect with time and so prepared, yet flowing and engaging, but sober. Sounds like an Alanis Morissette song now. You got my point. Yeah, well, this is really so much related to also what I'm doing now, this control and vulnerability, Jamie. I agree that they're very much there. The way I'm looking at it now, but I haven't even finished gathering the data, so it's very much brainstorming at the moment. Because I've noticed how also dating apps, specifically, dating apps in general, some more than others, for someone more than other. I'm not going into detail now, but they also provide some sort of platform to rehearse and produce in a Foucauldian way one's sexual self, one's erotic self. I will just quote one participant that told me, well, once I turned 18, it was obvious for me and my friend to just download Tinder. It was like my driving license when I turned 18. There was like, oh, there is the driving license. And for this young woman and a group of friends, it was about Tinder. And she said, I would never actually date somebody because I don't think I am old enough. But I am there. And she was sort of rehearsing a very sexualized self, a very provocative self. She would consciously try to hook men and mess around with her friends as well. So it was also a social way of saying, hey, I behave like this. What do you think? So there is a social dimension of, I think, an hermeneutic of an erotic self that is even more evident, I think, when it comes to exploring perhaps non-heteronormative sexualities, or anyway, sexual countercultures. I don't know what term is the best here. So for instance, I talked to a young woman in Naples, that is not exactly San Francisco in terms of sexual liberation. And she was saying, oh, I'm interested in women. Hence, I changed Tinder setting. And now she's hanging out with a couple of women, and she's seeing if perhaps she can be the unicorn of this couple, if they can become a triple, etc. And so it is, if you want to explore a sexual culture or a romantic culture, certain dating apps offer this possibility of something in between, the actual doing it with your body and the just fantasizing about it. So I'm playing around these ideas here, because I think there is a lot of room for further exploration. And so now, wow, there are so many interesting comments already in the chat. And also there are quite a few people that I know in the audience, and I know that they have something to say. So I will ask Nate to promote everybody to a panelist according to the Zoom affordance. And also let me just grab the opportunity to thank Nate, who has the glorious director of the Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick.
Hi, everyone.
That has given me and us the platform to run these events. So, well, I can see that one of the first to appear is indeed Anya Malinowska. Anya has presented in our first event.
Hi there.
Hi. So I'm sure that you have something to say. I could bet my money on it.
Yeah, I would like to thank both Sam and Jamie for their presentation, and which made me think about my own work on like sensitive media, at some point I commented about like the paper Toby Miller and I released in 2017, when we were writing about the effective quality of the very media, of applications, of devices with which we become emotionally related, like separately from the actual people behind them. So this is like a very interesting thing, but I've never heard like a perspective that Sam and Jamie like presented on this topic. So excellent perspectives. Thank you so much. I just need to digest everything that has just happened, and I will just kind of, I'm looking forward to the follow-up discussion. So so it's just so something's in the air, something's going on, like definitely those ideas, like they emerge separately but they overlap. This is what I've been thinking, and I know that Carolina has been also writing about it, so it's very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm just like, I will be like here listening to the discussion.
Thank you, Anya. When you want, feel free to break into the discussion, and this, of course, applies to Anya and also everybody else. So let's see if we have some question in the, how can I say, in the traditional sense. Oh, Ricky, you're saying you have data that show that apps become the community to explore new sexualities. That's great. Would you like to tell us more?
Sure. Thank you very much, Sam, for your talk, and Jamie, your discussion too. Those were resonating with me. I'm looking also at online dating apps, but I'm looking across sexualities and gender. So I have a lot of crazy data and intersectional data, but I've definitely noticed a number of people talking specifically about using the apps as their place to kind of try on new sexualities. And what was specifically interesting is the example that, Sam, that you gave, where the person talked about how the apps will give community. I thought, wow, I saw people who were talking about it was like their first trip to the gay bar in a neighborhood where nobody would know they were. So where they weren't doing that in their offline communities, they didn't feel safe enough. They were worried that people would see them or that they would get outed. And I particularly had somebody in my study who lived between the US and Korea, and she only felt safe to use the apps in Korea because her family wasn't in Korea as much. So she felt like she could even explore it in a different physical place, but she still used the apps as her way to tether and find her way into the gay scene because she didn't actually know where the physical places were. So it was it's an interesting way in which people are negotiating. And I've also had people, Carolina, say similarly that they changed their settings to try to explore things that they didn't realize was an option and that they wouldn't have had the access to in their physical spaces. So I think us considering the ways in which digital spaces are, I think the problem of online and offline blurring more and more is that that maybe we really should just look at how it's all working together rather than trying to always parse it out separately, because I think for our participants, it really is kind of one place at times, and one facilitates use of the other. So, and Carolina, I'd love to talk to you more about yours too down the road, your data.
My question, if I may, it's a follow-up question. Thank you, Ricky, so much. Super interesting comment. I'm thinking, wow, just as you were speaking about like what builds the tension? Is it like the offline and online reality, or actually the social body versus the actual body? Because like I'm just thinking like where does the problem with the body come from? Where does it come from? So it turns out like in this specific context of this debate, of those presentations, that this is like a fear, not of the body like a physical body, but offline being just like connected with the problematic socialization of the body and the problematic context. So I just wanted to could you comment upon this? This is actually a question. Is it like valid?
Should I go ahead? Yeah, Anna, thank you so much. I think you put in a much particular way that I do. Like I said earlier, I think like the whole book, I do not only just talk about app experience. I always connect that to the macro structures in my every chapters, because Jamie read that. In every chapters, I try to portray what's happening. I do not like the word offline online, because like the macro structure also happening online everywhere. But I'm talking about like what's happening, existing, if the app doesn't exist. For example, without the app, homosexuality is highly stigmatized. Female homosexuality is even more stigmatized because of these different historical reasons. And under this macro structures, what apps can do or intervene. So, but then I love the way that you put it. You talk about social body and the actual body, and how I think your language is actually much like accurate in describing this. It's not online, offline anymore. Even when Ricky talked about the Korean girl, when she go back to Korea, she's using the app. So what's changed is not actually the app so much, but actually also her surrounding, who's around her. Her family members are not in Korea. Her family members is in US. That's why she feels safe. So sometimes I feel like when we talk about offline too much, sometimes when we talk, I feel like when we talk about the distinguish between online, offline too much, that actually is leading us to a wrong direction. It's not the division between online and offline anymore. It's more complicated than that. So thank you, Anna. So
thank you for all your comments so far. They've been my mind is whirring. I'm just trying to hopefully I'll make sense. So I agree with I agree with what Sam says essentially, and I also don't see much value in online and offline. That isn't how. I mean, there might be some analytical value in certain contexts to think in that way, but certainly in terms of when you do ethnographic work, that isn't a world that isn't a distinction that I think they necessarily are making. And so I think partially it is also to do with not only their informants' perceptions of the world, but also the epistemological perspectives that we take, right? And the two, I mean, I outlined the one that I take, which was this whole kind of British cultural studies kind of conjunctural analysis, which was partially in response to some of the Marshall McLuhan work and Ronan Williams' critiques famously, kind of the technological determinism. And so I'm always minded to kind of see those all things kind of in tension, multiple elements in tension at one time. And more recently, the kind of new materialism, kind of assemblage theory, Deleuze and Guattari. I think there's also, another epistemological approach which understands the kind of overlapping and interconnected nature of these things, which for different reasons you might separate in certain instances. But yeah, I mean, so there's a theoretical kind of point there, I guess, also to make. So yes, I think the other thing I wanted to say, and I think this might be more in relation to, I guess, Carolina's comment before, was, and I think, Ricky, you might have said something. Anyway, it's about this notion. There's some really interesting debates when it comes to gaming and hookups apps about the role that discourse plays in inciting certain types of sexual subjectivity. So Kane Race, in his book, The Gay Science, ends his book discussing what's happened to gay culture and to gay sexuality when so much of it is now defined by drop-down menus, where people are having to identify in gay culture as, for instance, top or bottoms. I'm over 40, in my 20s. I don't think people defined it as top or bottoms. I mean, they may have done in San Francisco in the 70s with the hanky codes or whatever, but I mean, top or bottom, those sexual acts were things you might do, and you might have a preference for one. But the discourse you now see in social media around I am a top, I am a bottom, is I think in large part actually related to these drop-down menus and the way that these discourses begin to shape sexual subjectivity. And he kind of is critical of that and wonders about the sort of, I think he's very interested in the contingencies of gay sexual cultures in a different time and in a different place. And so I don't know how I feel about my control vulnerability. You know, I need to think about it a bit more. There are places where it makes sense to have control, right? So people talked about being able to block racists, right? You don't want that unexpected contingency in your intimate space, right? So for me, there's still a lot to unravel. But yeah, I suppose I'm just kind of slightly randomly bouncing off things that struck me most out of those three comments. So thank you for all of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Let's see if we have some other question. Perhaps Sarah. It's because I have also the direct messaging function, so I'm not calling people that don't expect me to call. But Sarah, if you want to say something, Sarah Sefai has also written about Tinder and their experience there. Hi, hello.
Hi. Yeah, I'm listening keenly, particularly to the way you're talking about vulnerability and control, and I'm trying to think of an intervention, but I haven't quite worked out what it is yet. I think that what you're saying about masculinity and work and, you know, the conjunctural moment and everything, like, of course, yeah, you really see that in the heterosexual context. And there is definitely something around the culture of the app, right? So it's like, oh, I've met you on this app, therefore this encounter means this, etc., etc. And definitely there's something very interesting around the way that the user carries the affective experience of that app into other things, or the way also it gets attached to that app. So I definitely see all the resonances there between what you're saying and a very short piece I wrote about Tinder that is not based on research, I should say, which is why I'm being a little bit on the spot. But I suppose what I'd like to work out a little bit more that I don't see worked out yet is I definitely think that defensiveness, I would say defensiveness right now in terms of the affective structure, because I think defensiveness already reveals that relationship between vulnerability and control. And I wrote a piece on humiliation that was edited with Zoe, who's I think somewhere in here. Hi, Zoe. So yeah, I mean, for me, I was linking that to humiliation in terms of the put down. So I mean, I don't really have a concrete intervention other than I do think this is the space in terms of like affect, culture, and then the kind of how a sense of identity, or how identity as a structure is constantly doing the work of territorializing the experience through the way that people then tend towards particular responses, like, for example, getting offended, right? Or being prepared to be offended. And of course, then it's like self-perpetuating. And there is definitely something really clear about enclosure. And like the more you go back to the scene, the more it gets reified. And then there's this question of how to untangle that, which I think is partly why people, you know, delete the app, rejoin the app, and all of that is part of it. And then the whole culture of gaming the app and gaming the algorithm is all part of it, because of course when you join, your setting is neutral and all of that. So there are other strategic reasons why people, yeah, they're trying to outsmart the app so that they actually make it work for them, because the algorithm often doesn't work for you, as we were discussing in another session. Hi, Zoe. So I don't know, other than, yeah, I'm interested to read your work to see how you're I don't know, like, yeah, how you're understanding them. I suppose the gendered aspect of that. I mean, I suppose for me, the other thing I was really thinking, to be honest, when you were talking, I was really thinking about like the stranger, and you know, just really like fundamentally how to actually understand, you know, the sociality of strangers. I mean, but I'm sure this is something that many people here have read more about, just more broadly in terms of digital culture, and and it's just, yes, the precarity of it, the fluidity of it. I mean, and of course that cuts across other contexts, not just dating apps, but that's it's a very challenging space, I think, to try and understand the particularity of those kind of interactions and the potential of those forms of certain forms of violence or transgression that are occurring, yeah, in that cultural space. So that, I mean, just total ramble there, but like, if you had a more specific question, or I meant to ask you a question, but yeah, so just ramble, sorry, but very interesting, yeah.
Well, actually, perhaps this is a bit my taste, but I really like when, you know, if we were in a room just thinking together, that would have been the kind of normal intervention. So I thank you very much, Sarah, because I think that you know, it's not easy to think together in this setting and to sort of say something that is not super polished, but I think is the most valuable. So thank you very much. And this sort of, it's also one of the reason, or at least my desire in setting up this whole series, is to kind of mapping the field, kind of understanding what kind of territory are we going through. And Nate.
Sorry, can I just respond to that? Because I'm formulating something in my head and I need to get it out. Otherwise I'm going to forget it. So Sarah, thank you. Yes, I could see threads in what you were talking about. So there was definitely continuity in those statements. And I wonder if, I mean, okay, so the tradition, I guess, that I'm working out of is very attentive to cultural specificity. And so so the uninstalling, reinstalling, I mean, I didn't talk about so specifically in my discussion. Gay men did talk about that, but they talked about it for different reasons to Sam's, right? So the things that it sounds like you're coming from a kind of more psychoanalytical, critical, theoretical kind of perspective, those kind of, so those humiliations for gay men on Grindr are different humiliations to perhaps Tinder users. Gay men do use Tinder. So, and the violence is different. And so the reason that, so thinking about the specificity of gay men in London and Edinburgh, which is where we're doing the interviews, what's different to the context, certainly that Sam's talking about, is they're not, I actually expected to read Sam's chapter and find the same things, but of course that would be mad. I don't know why I thought that. And it was very illuminating to find out that they did it because they were fearful of being gay. Well, that isn't the case in London and Edinburgh. The reasons they leave Grindr is because it produces a huge amount of anxiety for the people and the rejection that they feel in the sorts of body and sexual cultures which are hegemonic in gay culture. They're not the only ones that exist, but they're certainly perceived to be kind of hegemonic, is partially the reason why it's not because they're frightened their family are going to find them. It's not because, you know, the reasons that Sam gave in that context. It's because gay culture produces, for some people, a set of pressures, and I guess you would say violences, that they find overwhelming at some point. And that gives them a sense of control. I mean, of course, you could think about it more ontologically and think, well, just being a subject in the world is filled with vulnerability and all sorts of social relations. You know, the encounter with the stranger. Also, there's a great, Samuel Delaney writes a beautiful ethnography of straight, and so do Lauren Ballant and the Eagleman. Gay men are public, just my last thing, sorry, because I'm also rambling, is gay sexual cultures are more used to encountering the stranger. in the cruising cultures and in public sex spaces where you have entirely anonymous sex in a way that I think can often be dangerous in heterosexuals, or it doesn't happen quite so much because it can be dangerous in heterosexuals. Not all there are queer kind of heterosexuals. There are queer heterosexuals too, so there are specificities which perhaps make things different, which we need to think about.
Can I respond? Sorry, just before you, if you want to say something, Sam, but actually, you see, that you're using control, right, to, well, I suppose I'm influenced quite a bit by affect studies, right? But like, so you're saying control, okay, fine, like on one level, fine, yeah, control. Whereas I would actually, I'm interested in how that maps, and this is from the perspective of a teacher with the younger people as well, but I'm interested in how that maps again to defensiveness in the sense of that reaction, which is, no, that's not my problem, done with that, right? Which is like I don't know if it's like a decision, a knee-jerk decision, this idea of kind of, you know, switching off or turning away from the awkwardness, or like speak to the hand or something. I think that, you know, in terms of like social antagonisms or something, there are new cultural forms or tactics that people are using when they can't cope with a situation or something like that. So yes, I mean, those terms are there, right? Because then that goes back to vulnerability, and then that goes back to the question of like, well, what social, you know, and one of the things I've, you know, experienced clearly, because I don't have research funding and to do research like this, but one of the things I've experienced is this question about, you know, what's the social vocabulary, what's the language that's available to me in terms of responses to particular situations that I'm put in, you know, even as, you know, a profile with like 3 words that have been exchanged and so on. So I think that what you're identifying there is really, I'm not sure, because in a way, if you start talking about control, you might then like reinscribe a little bit a certain, not intentionally, but a certain, you know, fantasy of a sort of autonomous subject, and there might be a fantasy of autonomy that's very important there for that person in that moment, but that's a powerful neoliberal fantasy, isn't it? So yeah, it's...
I mean, and it's the mastery of non-sovereignty is the, you know, going back to the Lacan. I don't disagree with you. I don't think we're in disagreement.
No.
I've just
exploring the language for it.
And I'm not sure how I feel about control, about they're using the word, so it's a question of me interpreting what they think they're gaining or what they think they're doing, and it could very easily be a fantasy of neoliberal autonomy. But those are the words of my participants, and I have to kind of deconstruct that, I suppose. So that's very helpful. So thank you.
And I would like to know what Sam thinks, and then Nate.
Yeah. So actually, when Jamie first talked about the control versus vulnerability, that contradictions, something that just popped into my mind is like it's from very hardcore interpersonal communication theory. Baxter dialectics talk about predictability and novelty. So the way that why people want to control because they want to predict, but then they also want to let go of themselves to be vulnerable because they also appreciate the novelty. So actually, I see lots of things that we're talking about, but in different fields, in different disciplines, we are using very different terminologies. And of course, I really agree. Like in my work, I always talk about the cultural and social specificity. Even when Jamie, you just talk about gay men are used to like meet with strangers. That is our generations. That may not be the younger folks' generations. So when I talk to my younger gay informants, they did not experience the life that you and I have experienced when we were younger. We went to gay bars, we talked to strangers. They never do that. They never do that in their school, like ever, never. So that's why they feel surprised because of those harassing messages. You and I may feel, all right, we got that. Even if we go to a bar, someone touch us. We kind of feel like we're accustomed to that. So So even though I'm talking about the same culture in southern China, but different age generation, they are also already exposed to different social norms and expectation. And we must take into this account when we interpret the experience. And when you talk about harassment, their harassment may be different from my version of harassment. So thank you, Carolina. And Nat, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Let me just, I've got a fan on here at my in my garden office because it's about 45 degrees or something, as you can maybe detect. And there's also a kids party happening just out the front of the window. So apologies in advance. Yeah, thanks for two great talks. My question is actually for Jamie, and I'm really interested. So sorry, Sam. I really loved your talk, but something that Jamie said made me really curious to kind of follow up, and it's about the conjunctural method that you draw upon. It's something. I guess my own background is in the kind of Australian variant of cultural studies that pays homage to the British version. It's a kind of colonial cultural studies that I'm a part of. But they and I've been recently kind of reading or rereading Raymond Williams' work because I'm doing some stuff on the everyday and culture, ordinary culture, and so on. But one of the things that I was really interested in is basically in these discussions, like the role of the app itself, and whether or not, like if we take like an object, like a dating app, and you've got a kind of like a classical cultural studies approach. We could take the Sony Walkman example and the kind of the cycle of these various things that most of us are probably familiar with. But in some of the work I've been doing around, like in the space of app studies, where kind of materiality is really understood in quite a different sense, right? So it's thinking like on an infrastructural level about the app, like what kind of web servers is the app connecting to? What kind of trackers are built into the software? What kind of software development kits, is the app comprised of, and who controls that space? Is it Android Studio and so on? And then thinking about all of the third-party trackers that are in these apps, then moving to, interface design, which is a kind of space of affect and experience and so on. But what I'm interested in is like, what, if any, is the role? Because it's one thing to say, this is a confirmation of a, or this is a take on neoliberal subjectivity, and there's a kind of leap to the conjunctural, or there's a kind of gathering that involves bringing together these different, there's some political economy, there's identity, and pulling them together, and I've just been thinking about what to make of the app, which in itself is a kind of, I'm not sure if it's a conjunctural object, but it exists, it's already distributed, it already has a political economy, it already has forms of individuation and subjectivity, and how to kind of put that next to this kind of more cultural studies method. What's the relationship between these two things, if anything? And I'm just interested in whether or not you've kind of thought about those types of relations, or if they play a role in in what you've done, and for Sam as well, if that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, I mean, I kind of go to the Association of Internet Researchers conferences, and I see people do that kind of infrastructural analysis, I mean, I think the best way for me, I don't know if this is what you were saying, but the way that I often think about this is the kind of emergence of new materialism as an epistemology that helps make sense of the world, that's particularly kind of useful, I think, in terms of understanding the role of non-human objects and technology. And I guess that I find that useful too. I guess something that I think is sometimes missing for me in terms of the questions that I want to ask is the question of older materialisms, right? And so I'm interested in the kind of interests and the kinds of that mobilize and motivate the kind of assemblages. And I sometimes think that object-orientated ontologies and things like that pay a lot of attention to the material infrastructuring, but I'm also interested in the kind of historical movements and dynamics that end up producing those infrastructures. So I'm not saying that some new materialists don't do that, but I think just sometimes it's a question of emphasis. And the question for me about thinking about that stuff together is conjunctural analysis enables me to answer the questions that I want to ask. And so, yes, you can totally look at the app itself as a conjunctural object, as a kind of as a way that certain kind of interests and historical forces have come together at a certain time in the interests of certain people. It just so happens that I'm interested in the way that people make sense of their use of apps. It's just a different thing that you want to look at. One isn't right and one isn't wrong. That 100, I mean, the Walkman, I mean, I haven't read that piece for a while, but as my understanding is that that is a conjunctural analysis of, well, what does this mean? And one of the things that I always remember about the Walkman is that it was a movement. They make the argument that, you know, at this moment of the introduction of neoliberalism, it's the movement to more individualized forms of music sharing as opposed to more collective forms of, and so that would be a conjunctural reading of a particular form of technology. So yes, you can, I mean, as I understand it, you can apply conjunctural analysis to any sort of cultural formation in order to help make sense of what that piece of technology or what that object does, and to also understand what's happening kind of culturally too. It's just that my focus is on what people's relationships to the apps are, as opposed to the kind of doing the walkthrough method and trying to look at the InDesign, you know, the design structures and look at the surface. It's just, I don't have that expertise, I don't have that background, but they're not opposed.
And I think this is one of the our difficulties and beauty of these topics of studies, that you really have a super interdisciplinary object. And that's why I think it is important to engage in this interdisciplinary dialogue, although sometimes it is a bit weird, as we said before. Okay, perhaps you're saying the same thing with different. But yes, but I think this is I mean, this is never enough, right? If we want not to end up just repeating our disciplinary jargon all over again. And I think that Nate question is quite. I always wonder. Okay, I look at the subject. My method is ethnography, and I have a background in philosophy and cultural studies. But then there is also this object. So before, when I was talking about how people access different cultures. Oh, and by the way, this is the time in which we understand that we're gonna run out of time because we're enjoying it so much. So I was saying, people explore different romantic cultures. So in this sense, the dating apps may be empowering, but then also there is a sense in which, of course, the app as a product and as a service and as a sustainable, profitable business also kind of wants or needs to be sticky and to expand the pool of services. And from an app viewpoint in terms of business, the more people you look for, the more romantic culture, sexual cultures to explore, the more you stay on the app, the more you rely on that service. Is what Tinder tagged the swipe life. So they are very much kind of an assemblage, to use a fancy word. But Sam, what do you think? And then we have Arturo.
Yeah, so in fact, in my work, I do not just look at users. The problem of American education is I take classes, so many classes. So before we start, actually, I took a class from Emma Castell. So we actually took classes with a lot of people, and lots of people actually from different backgrounds. Like I have a STS teachers, I have a sociology teacher. So they're basically asking us to think about, okay, if this is dating app is something that I'm interested in, then in their way, in their discipline, how would they tackle the problem? What angle do you look at that? So that's why not only I look at users, I study the app itself. I use the walkthrough methods to look at the app. Actually, I've written a paper to look at why Blue, the app, is so successful. It just went public in US, but in China, still today, homosexuality is highly stigmatized. A Chinese gay app went public in US. It's interesting. So why the app is so successful? So I look at the user, I look at the management. I have a co-author who actually have ethnographic data. He researched for 3 years in Beijing in the company. So that is he has very interesting data. So that's why we came up with the idea. So can we look at the app itself, not the people, not the user, not the user, but the app itself, and then end up we're using the social construction of technology framework, which is from STS, kinds of like conjunctural, but not using the same language. But again, we look at the economic, social, cultural, legal factors that actually what happened in a contingency way. What happened at this point in China that enable the success of such an app. So maybe even one factor did not exist, the app could not exist because of that interconnected reasons. So yeah, so that's my quick response. So I also look at the app itself.
Also, just to say, perhaps to build on what you guys have said, well, maybe coming at this from a slightly different angle. I mean, I agree with everything that you guys are saying and the approaches that you take. But I mean, one thing that I think that you also have to take into account is that people don't always use the apps the way they're intended to, right? So there's some really important empirical work done on gay hookup apps where Andrew DJ Shield talks about how refugees move to, I think it's Denmark, it's definitely somewhere in Scandinavia, and they don't use it to hook up, they use it to exchange information about how to be a refugee. So it's completely against the intention of it. And there's also, Rachel Katz has just finished a PhD about tourism and how people use it to find out where bars are. So, I mean, those things, I think hegemonically, they are used as they are intended. But there are moments where people go against the assemblage, as it were, or reconfigure the assemblage by their use. It's not always about what the app designers and what the economic model wants them to be used for. Do you know what I mean? So I think that has to be taken into account too.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, well, I would have so many things to say, but shut up for now. And Arturo, do you want to? Your hands is no more up, but now I hold you. So. And Arturo Bandinelli he has my same surname. It's not a coincidence. It's also my brother and co-author. So we wrote together actually the article on dating apps, digital economy, and the dialogue between Arturo and I. It's also this interdisciplinary dialogue. Arturo is a training psychoanalyst and started PhD in psychosocial studies, and he says. Lacan every 5-6 words in general. This is a rough estimate, and he doesn't want me to say this sort of thing, but it was just to present Arturo that. So I want to know what you're gonna bring to this interdisciplinary table. Arturo is not trained in cultural studies, Nate. So
my sister is lying. So what I will bring instead to this table is Lacan. No, I'm joking.
My sister is lying. I'm not your brother.
I'm not your brother. No, I just wanted to say it was very fascinating to listen to these kind of rich presentations and conversation that emerged. And I think that, I mean, for me, there are obviously a lot of questions, obviously with how we define, for example, how we define the relationship between discourse or systems and the object. Because in some sense, sometimes the object seems to become a sort of side of conflict, of ambiguity. So it sort of crystallizes a social, we could say, conflict but you could also then look through a more STS analysis at the networks, and there you see that the conflict perhaps is not so needed to think the phenomena. So I think there is a very interesting way in which dating apps, precisely because they have so much in them, challenge every approach, right? Because the other thing, it's for me, and that's maybe something that emerged is really, I think for me, theoretically, it's always interesting from a psychoanalytic perspective to differentiate identity from subjectivity. I think that is something that can help us. And I would say that subjectivity, of course, includes identity, but it's the singular relation that the user has with the identity. And sometimes these two, when they are used interchangeably, you know, when you talk about social identity, oh, that's a subjectivity. So it's the relationship with one's identity. And that kind of identity tends to melt down, let's say, or to become vulnerable when a certain scene of intimacy can occur, especially when there is when the body is there as well. So for me, that's a really interesting juncture of thinking the question from the point of view of the subject, let's say. But then, of course, there is this other big elephant in the room, which is, of course, there are these objects and they have their own agencies, they have their own affordances and their own designs. And perhaps that is something that also a psychoanalytic understanding has to take into account differently, that the object is not this kind of passive entity. It's not just the object of fantasy. It does certain things. It resists certain things that we think we're doing. So yeah, so there are a lot of questions I have. These are just some thoughts, maybe more comments, but opening certain spaces to question our disciplines.
Thank you, Jamie. I was noticing you were nodding. Well, how would you respond?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I feel a bit schizophrenic at the moment as I'm doing this research because, you know, psychoanalysis I find very compelling. My colleagues don't, really. And certainly Deleuze and Guattari, who are kind of don't. But, you know, I think that what you're saying is absolutely true. So for me, the most convincing work that I've read on intimacy is the psychoanalytic kind of inflected work, and the queer theory from the end of the 90s onwards, Edelman and Berlin and whatever, I think has been the most, I blame Zizek. Yeah, yes, absolutely. So what you're saying just makes a lot of sense to me, and I think could be completely applicable to the kind of data that we're finding in terms of subjectivity and identity and the place of intimacy in this more psychoanalytic understanding of intimacy. Catherine Angel's recent book, actually, on consent, I've also found very compelling for kind of similar reasons. She kind of is kind of clearly rooted in the same. I'm nodding because I just find psychoanalysis very compelling, but I don't use it myself. And everything Arturo just said, I could think of ways of applying to. As it's clear, you know, my conclusions aren't developed because we're just about to start the proper analysis. And so I'm grateful for the kind of degree of discussion, because everyone has, you know, contributed some really interesting ways of thinking about intimacy, for me anyway.
Thank you. And Sam, do you want to add something?
I'm good. I myself is not familiar too much with psychoanalysis. Like, I'm not trained in this discipline. Like, I don't think I've already read some like basic readings when I was younger. Yeah.
May I say something, Carolina? Sorry.
Of course.
Okay.
So, to ask you to say something, because
Arturo mentioned something very interesting. You know how, like, the devices, you know, exemplified here by dating apps, bring into play something that resists the intended design of those like platforms and devices. So this is what I find absolutely fascinating. And definitely it may sound very new materialist, because, you know, and I'm just bringing that up because, you know, Jamie mentioned the methodology. But this is what interests me. But at the very same time, you know, this resistance from what you were like talking about, like your experiences, the experience of your research, this resistance does not show. And I've been thinking, and it's a very cultural studies, like a problem and question, to what an extent this dating apps, especially for like gay people, have contributed to unnecessary assimilationism, so to speak. Yes, so just kind of this idea of like assimilationism culture that wants to catch up with the status quo, instead of like offering something perhaps more closeted or maybe something more against the grain that could perhaps come from this resistance offered by the devices, the affordances, and blah blah blah. I don't know. This is what I've been just thinking a lot while you were talking. I don't know if I made myself clear, if my point is clear. But I very often find, especially when Jamie was talking about the drop down like identity that is replacing the binary identity, right? So instead of like offering something completely alternative, it's a kind of a very sad replacement. And that made me think how that may contribute to the kind of, you know, assimilation culture that is trying to like catch up with the norm and normativity associated with heterosexual normativity, but you know, it's just not limited to that. And so this is like another, I mean, this is a question I've been like contemplating, a problem I've been contemplating. I don't know if this is clear what I want to say.
Yes, I think it is clear enough, I would say. Clear enough to leave that room for exploration. I like how, Nate, you put it in the chat that my partner is saying hello from the balcony. I like the way you put it in the chat, the architecture choice of identity. And I think if I interpreted you well, Anya, you were saying, well, this is kind of a poor alternative to the female binary.
Yes, because you know, it's like interesting how cyberspace, being binary, by the way, but has been always like theorized as something to overcome binaries, Sadie Plant, for instance, specifically gender binaries, and any binaries those gender binaries entail. And so what we've been doing, we've been like replacing those binaries with like, for instance, like drop downs, which like, again, define what you have to choose from. So there is this kind of this definition of, I don't know, identity, maybe subjectivity. I'm just misusing the term subjectivity, but I've been often writing and talking about template subjectivity we are now coping with. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you can comment. And I believe it's part of like assimilationism. The problem that I used to do camp studies a lot. Like a lot of my PhD was on like queer cultures and aesthetics. So this is where my question comes from. And I've never been thinking about it, to be perfectly honest. So over to you, over to the expert.
If I'm allowed to, sorry, Jamie, just a question. I will come out and say I'm not familiar with the term assimilationism. Of course, I know what assimilation means, but perhaps you can say a few more words.
So at some point, there was one book by Mo Mayer who was writing about like homosexual assimilationism. So like, instead of being closeted, excuse me, it's for my boys, my sons, I'm sorry, in the background, apologies. They make noise. So Mo Mayer was talking about like ghetto culture against closet culture, like a real queer culture that does not want to assimilate, but like develops their own culture. And he found homosexual assimilationism, the tendency to like gay marriages, blah, 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 found certain danger in that. So while you were just talking, I was thinking about like dating applications as maybe kind of a new incarnation of this assimilationism, something that catches up with a status quo, like pretends to be normal, like generating like a trap for something that could be like refreshing and very invigorating. And you know, and Jamie's comment upon the drop down, the drop downs from which you have to choose your status, you're just like that kind of, you need to like situate yourself against like another in the exchange from the like a very limited thing. And it's all like the queer subject is like inherently the subject, like overcoming any binary, any like restricted, constrained, definitional identity, subjectivity, behavior, persona, you name it. I don't know. I just wanted to hear about that from you.
Okay, so I'm very grateful for all these comments because my brain is exploding. And again, I'm going to try and do my best to be coherent. So you're making me think about lots of things. And so one is I think dating apps are understood to be a problematic site sometimes for homonormativity because to some degree they continue the kind of cultures of kind of promiscuous sexual cultures, which a sort of politics of homonormativity would rather kind of not exist anymore. So in that respect, they're not. But in other respects, I see what you're saying, but maybe from a slightly different angle. So some of the most interesting arguments I've read, not so much actually about gay men and hookup apps, but about the recent proliferation of terms for gendered identity, right? And the kind of increased fashionability of just this enormous proliferation. One of the arguments that I've heard, and it's quite plausible to me, although it kind of goes against the approaches I take when I try to understand the relationship between gender and technology, nonetheless, it's still very attractive to me, is that one of the reasons there are so many proliferations of gender terminologies is because of the ability to hashtag content, right? So you can have hashtag demisexual, hashtag asexual, hashtag, and these become global sites where global users can kind of come together and kind of exchange culture and ideas and form and attach themselves to an identity. That in a different moment of pre-internet, there were much less spaces for these dispersed subjects to kind of come together and to try and think about who they were in slightly different terms. And what people then say is actually what one of the arguments is what these different gender identities in that context do is just provide more means of capital accumulation for digital capitalism. The more data points you can create, the happier Mark Zuckerberg is, basically. And so whatever that's doing for people in their personal life and however that lives out, how they live that out every day, and whatever violence they may or may not find in living out these kind of new proliferation of terms, ultimately it doesn't matter to digital capitalism anyway, because it's assimilating them into this new model of data accumulation. And so partially what you're saying, Anna, I suppose we have to think about not only generationally, like Sam pointed out before, but again, conjuncturally, what type of capital accumulation is hegemonic within the particular historical conjuncture we're talking about? And actually this thing which seems to have a lot of resistance, the multiplicity of new terms for gender, actually serves contemporary capitalist relations in a way that a previous generation of LGBT activists never imagined gay identity could. So that's what you're making me think. So in that respect, there are compelling arguments to suggest these new digital forms of gendered identity and sexual practice are precisely assimilating to the hegemonic form of capitalism. Sorry, Sam, I think that's me.
Thank you, Jamie. And yes, I think we're getting into a very interesting debate, so I would carry on. If someone has to go, of course, we won't blame you. Ricky.
Thanks. I guess also talking a little bit about what Jamie was, where Jamie was going with the labels, because that was what was striking to me when we started talking about the menus. I'm looking at the kind of, like Sam, I look at users and apps. And by the way, I'm not a cultural studies person. I come out of discourse studies, but I'm in an interdisciplinary arts and science school with 150 faculty. And I bet only 25% are cultural studies people. So just side note. But I'm also looking at how the app design also constructs identity and kind of forces people into certain categories. And I'm looking at it more from a Foucauldian standpoint in how the labels really become a way to discipline the body. They become a way to quantify and count, which obviously fits into Jamie's discussion of hashtags. I hadn't thought about it around hashtags. I've been thinking about it in terms of counting algorithms, kind of the whole capitalist model and how to fit people into boxes. And what's interesting is at the beginning, many of them used very much binary types of filtering systems, like even around gender. When you would sign up, you had to be either man or woman. Those were your options. You were looking for men or women. Those were your only options. And so what's kind of interesting is how even the technology is shifting beyond a simple binary and trying to become more inclusive, but at the same time creating so many categories that unless the design of the app lets people pick multiple categories, they then make it impossible for people to also recognize intersectional kinds of positionalities and identities. So I think it's interesting to watch how the technology is also trying to manage the changing language. See, I'm coming from discourse studies, trying to manage the changing language and the multiplicity of labels that society is trying to negotiate and manage and figure out how they become ways to talk about who we are, but also for, I'd say, the platform producers to still, I like the comment of digital capitalism, right? Because they still need to use us. I mean, we're users. So I found this a really productive conversation about this, and I've jotted down a million notes. So thank you for the conversation from these very different disciplinary cultural studies references.
Thank you, Ricky. Sam.
Yes, I actually want to jump in about the label, the pull-down menu Jamie and Anna talked about. I completely agree that the label or the binary between top or bottom actually put people back into some boxes. Is kind of recreate the homonormativity that you have to be muscular, you be white, etc. But then a few days ago, I actually have a conversation with my friend who looked at BL culture in Asia, boy love culture, and he particularly looked at how the BL culture from Taiwan is exported to Japan. Something that is so fascinating to me is that actually younger Japanese folk who are just start to expose their sexuality, those labels give them life. Those labels give them terminology to navigate those spaces. And that's why he and I was thinking about, sometimes when we are here right now in the Zoom space, we are all from mostly Western spaces. We are kind of like critique this kind of labeling, this kind of pull down menu, which are actually limiting choices. But sometimes I just cannot stop thinking, maybe in some regions, those labels it doesn't mean make sense, but give people their subjectivity. If I don't know how to, I'm not sure I use the word correctly, or like label, identity, or subjectivity, but those labels actually make sense to them. So that's why when I think about especially when I incorporate Western literature in Asian context, I always struggle, like, to what extent I should agree or go with the critique that we are in this room are talking about. But then at what point I should say, hey, actually, but in this region, to this particular group of people, having a date, having dating apps, although it's all masculine, it's white, it's like whatever, that is already a gift to them, So this is a debate that I constantly have whenever I conduct research outside the American European context.
Sam, I completely agree with you, and even within it, because one of the, I found Kane Race's discussion at the end of his chapter about critiquing the way you have to use language to articulate sexual desire and to signal your interest. So he says that kind of screens off certain possibilities, right? So he's critical of that. But generationally, so it's not only regionally, but generationally, and also intersectionally. So something that has come up a lot with the trans men that we've spoken about is how important the articulation of their sexual desire is in those spaces. And there's so little that articulates it for them in a way. A slightly older generation who's been used to kind of a certain kind of gay sexual culture for the last 40 years has just internalized the articulation of certain practices and expectations. Whereas the younger trans men who are kind of occupying this space need to be articulating their desires in order to build a shared kind of culture, perhaps. So I don't know how, I'm formed by my generational attachments, of course, but I absolutely recognize, and that's apparent in the data, that what you're saying is very recognizable to the younger and people who are differently positioned to a 40-year-old gay man who grew up with queer theory. So yeah, I accept exactly what you're saying.
Well, I guess it's not the problem with like the labels themselves. The problem is when they become labeled, but at the beginning they're not labeled. They are ways of thinking, ways of making sense, ways of communicating, ways of recognizing. They are sort of hermeneutic of the self. And yes, I'm a fellow of Holdy and Ricky. And but then I think there is a sense in which in contemporary Western cultural policy and identity politics within the social media public sphere, these indeed have become used and weaponized, not by everybody, but at the level of the mainstream discourse and cultures as label and hashtag indeed. So that what I'm noticing in my observation is that there is also a sense in which at some point these labels represent a kind of a demand. I have to define myself in some ways. And this identification also creates a sense in which everybody that's not like me, then it's different. And then there is also a complexity in finding out whose group should I belong to. What if I'm a queer I identify as a queer person, but I want a monogamous relationship. And then in my queer group, considered kind of heteronormative. But then, and in talking to young people on dating apps, I have kind of, I've observed these complexities, and at the level of, digital capitalism and how progressive is the contemporary brutalization of identity politics, because if you read Judith Butler, this is not what identity means. And there are huge questions. And we were talking a bit about it yesterday in a barbecue with Arturo, who raised his hand. So you want to add something?
No, I don't have much to add, but I think there is a huge, for me, there is a dialectical dimension that you first need words and words to articulate. And that is something that we've seen giving people a voice that didn't have, and spaces to, I think what Sam was talking about. I think, however, that this is a necessary but not sufficient political project, which is we have to then also not forget that another important freedom is the possibility to contest the very label we chose for ourselves. This is a very important thing, and this is a thing that gets a lot forgotten. And if you go the first step and you don't go into the other, within the sort of current framework of digital capitalism and datafication, then you are running a big risk.
What was the second step? I was reading Nate's chat. Sorry, I got distracted.
I think there is a first step, which is precisely to have words, to articulate a social position, to exist, to come into being, we can say, as social beings. But then there is a second step, which I think is necessary. Is not the first one. Is not. Now you have destroyed my argument, which was very
necessary but not sufficient.
The first one, the articulation, the coming into being in the social. But there is a second one, which I think it's of equal political importance, which is the possibility to contest the very label we chose for ourselves. And that's what you need in order to not just have identity, but also subjectivity. For subjectivity to become a relationship with an identity, a relationship that necessarily escapes any possibility for identity to absorb the whole of yourself, the whole of who you are. And I think that if you don't go into the second step as well, so allowing a space for, in some sense, my own identity to be negated, the one that I've chosen for myself to be negated, then within the sort of current framework of datafication and digital capitalism, you are playing in the hands of precisely those who then are using the data for very specific purposes. You don't hear much talking about the second one because it's logically second. Of course, you need to first have the first. And that's the problem, right? If you don't have the words, as Sam was saying, then what are we talking about? So you can't really do that. But I think it's important to try, I mean, at least that's what I'm trying to think this in two logical steps.
Thank you. And then I would like to hear from Sarah, and then we have a final round because I think that more than 2 hours on Zoom is illegal.
So I'd just like to raise a counterpoint, which is I'm not sure about the significance of the proliferation of those identity terms. I mean, like on the one hand, yes, of course, the proliferation is there and it means something. But then on the other hand, I think there's such a flattening or deadening of those terms. I don't think they do much, right? Versus, for example, a profile picture, right? Which is like really thoroughly like semiotically loaded and saturated, and you can basically say all kinds of things about someone based on and the culture we live in, or the conjuncture, whatever, based on that picture. And then of course the role of the kind of genre, the genres of the pictures, or I don't know if genres is, it is kind of the right term, I think, because it is about audiences and expectations and affect and all of that. So yeah, sort of yes and no, but thanks for sharing that link to the thing about templates, because I do think the question of language is very, very important, particularly though the limitations of language and written language, given that that's not how we communicate socially. And there is just something so elementary there that I also think we need to kind of unpack. But of course, to say that you're a woman or a man is a thoroughly meaningless statement to a certain extent. I mean, that was the whole point of the notion of something like a performative critique of identity and so on. So I think, yeah, it's another interesting area, but I wouldn't even say that that's got, I'd say something like, you know, I don't even think that has anything to do with identity as such, because, you know, identity is in the relation of power or how you're able to speak to someone else and how you're able to present yourself or whatever. I'm not sure about about the significance of those terms. Yeah, interesting though.
Jamie and Sam, I would like to hear your final comments, and then before we get arrested for Zoomology, I shall call this a day.
I mean, yeah, just what I've been saying, this has been this has honestly possibly been one of the most productive Zoom discussions I've ever had. So I'm very grateful for it. And I wasn't being kind before. I'm being sincere in saying that it was really something. Sam's book is great, and I'm going to be using it in my teaching, and I'm going to be using it in my research. And it was a really kind of fabulous opportunity to really think, you know, because so often as academics we kind of read like, and you know, it was a serious kind of thinking through, and it's helped shape the way we're doing stuff at this point of the project. So thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Carolina, for putting this together. I think we have also people doing abstractly, but not a lot of us talk to each other because we have our institutional disciplinary concern and burden. And I think this kind of conversation, putting people together, is so productive. Like, I'm actually reading the template culture right now. So thank you so much for all those information links that we share. And the question or the bomb that Sarah just left at the end, like about the labels, about the diversity of labels, which, you know, right now when I do more quant research, I also do surveys sometimes, it's so difficult right now because like the gender and sexual identity question, there are 3 options. And then eventually, you know, what we do is we just combine them together. So sometimes like I feel like, okay, we are let our respondent to pick their choice, but then in the black box, we're actually putting them together. I don't know what's the point for that, but I think this is something that we have to think more in the future. Thank you, Carolina. And thank you, Jamie, for your wonderful critique of my book, and really appreciate your comments as well. And they're very constructive. Thank you so much. And thanks all to spend your afternoon, evening, morning with us today.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Jamie and Sam, for your kind words. This is the reason why I organize this seminar, because then people tell me how good I am and how lovely it was. And my complexion becomes radiant.
Come on, I live for those discussions. Come on, Carolina.
Of course, but they also have an impact on skin tone. You can see it now because it takes a while to get in circulation. But I think today, especially, there was something when I was organizing these things that I was interested in, is that what if one can have an interdisciplinary dialogue, meaning that people come from different perspectives to talk about an object, and what if in academic talk one can share their thinking instead of showing off their argument. And what if, rather than having Q&A, one could have a conversation? And so I think that today we sort of got closer to this format in which, okay, now my thinking is transformed by these dialogues. To be honest with you, I have a lot more questions than answers, which I think is good on the one hand. Then at some point I will have to present in this article, I argue that I'm right. And one has to choose a vocabulary, and but I think that we got a bit lost, not in language today, in communicating in a productive way. I mean, and Sarah's final remark, what are we even talking about? Sorry for the brutal paraphrases. It was quite good, quite a good point to end it. But in a sense, also the fact that we ended up discussing identity politics, labels, gender, templates, whatever, it's quite consistent, because that has become very much a problem of language at some point. What words do I use? What words are the right one? What words do I use to define myself? How attached I become to words. And someone posted on Twitter a screenshot of a Stuart Hall book in which he says, well, I think the problem of American cultural studies is that, okay, we said that language is politics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that then politics is language, and the only political space is playing out with language. So I don't know what's the way out of it. Someone has a new word, perhaps, or something with an hyphen, whatever. But I hope that this discussion can carry on. And yes, our next event is in a couple of weeks. It's called The Dating Divide. And then we have the one in July, Post-Digital Intimacies, with Adrienne Evans and Shuaisha Wang. And then we have the final event in September with Dominique Beckman and another secret guest, which I still haven't secured or contacted or chosen, for that matter. So thank you, and enjoy your evening, night, whatever.
It's a great pleasure. Have a good one, everybody. See you next time. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Arturo. And